Ethan Robert never expected to die that day. One moment, he was driving home, lost in thought. The next, a violent crash, a crushing silence, and then the impossible. Floating above his lifeless body, he was pulled into a realm beyond time, where he met a being unlike anything on Earth, an alien intelligence that knew everything. Faced with a choice between eternity and returning to life, Ethan's journey would reveal truths that changed him forever.
The highway stretched ahead, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the fields beyond. A warm breeze whispered through Ethan Roberts' open window as he tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, absently following the rhythm of the classic rock song playing on the radio. He should have been relaxed. The drive home from the business conference had been smooth, the sky a perfect shade of blue, the temperature hovering at a comfortable 75 degrees. But something felt off. It was a sensation that had clung to him all day, an inexplicable weight in his chest. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Maybe it was just exhaustion. The past few months had been grueling. Long hours at work, a relationship that had quietly withered, and a gnawing sense that he was running out of time. He was 38, divorced, and childless, watching the years slip through his fingers like grains of sand. A sharp gust of wind rattled his car slightly, pulling him from his thoughts. He frowned. The forecast had called for calm weather. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He was being ridiculous. Still, his unease deepened as his mind wandered back to the dream, the one that had plagued him for the past week. It was always the same. Darkness, an overwhelming silence, then a figure shrouded in light, speaking in a voice he could never quite remember upon waking. The only words that lingered were cryptic and unsettling. "You must choose." He hadn't told anyone. What was there to say? It was just a dream, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced down. A missed call from his sister, Rachel. He sighed. They hadn't spoken much since their last argument, and guilt gnawed at him. He'd been meaning to call her, to tell her that despite everything, she was still the closest family he had.
"I'll call her when I get home," he told himself. Up ahead, the road curved slightly before dipping into a stretch of farmland. A few cars were scattered in the distance, their taillights blinking as the sun caught them. His seatbelt snapped him backward, a brutal force crushing the air from his lungs. The sheer violence of it was disorienting, a whirlwind of motion, a symphony of destruction. He registered fragments of sensation, his head whipping sideways, his shoulder slamming against the door, his right hand wrenching off the wheel as his car spun. The world outside tilted and blurred, the sun-streaked sky flipping end over end. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber filled his nostrils, thick and acrid. The taste of blood, sharp, metallic, coated his tongue. He was weightless. For a fraction of a second, a surreal silence settled. His mind clung to the absurd details. The way his coffee cup, once nestled securely in the cup holder, floated midair before colliding with the windshield. The way the radio still played, unfazed, a haunting melody drifting through the chaos. And then the second impact. The passenger side of his car slammed into something solid, the force sending a shockwave through his spine. His head snapped forward, and his chest struck the steering wheel with an unforgiving crack. Pain exploded through his ribs, his vision darkening at the edges. This is it. The thought came with eerie clarity. There would be no tomorrow, no waking up. He wouldn't call Rachel back, wouldn't apologize, wouldn't finish his novel, wouldn't find whatever it was he'd been searching for all these years. A sudden, crushing regret filled him, not of dying, but of wasting time. His eyelids grew heavy, his body slumping as if surrendering to the inevitable. His last conscious sensation was the faint, rhythmic flutter of his heartbeat. Then nothing. Darkness swallowed him whole. Silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a silence so deep, so absolute, that it pressed in on Ethan from all sides. Then light. He became aware of himself, floating above the wreckage. Below him, twisted metal and shattered glass glistened under the setting sun. His car sat at an unnatural angle, its front end completely crushed, steam hissing from beneath the mangled hood. The green sedan was overturned a few yards away, its roof caved in. People had gathered. Some stood motionless, hands covering their mouths, while others moved frantically. A woman in a red jacket pressed her hands to her temples, eyes wide with horror. Then he saw himself. His body was slumped against the steering wheel, blood streaking down his forehead, his right arm bent unnaturally. His chest barely moved. Oh my God, I'm dead. The thought should have terrified him. But it didn't. Instead, there was an odd sense of detachment, as if he were observing someone else entirely. He felt no pain, no fear, just a strange weightlessness. Then movement. From the corner of his vision, a figure emerged, stepping forward from the edges of the world itself. Ethan turned, and his breath, if he had any, caught in his throat. Rachel. His sister stood before him exactly as he remembered her before the accident that had taken her life 10 years ago. Her hair was still the same deep auburn, her green eyes filled with warmth. She was smiling. Ethan, she said softly. He felt something inside him crack wide open. Rachel, he whispered, reaching out. His fingers passed through her like mist, but he could feel her presence, her energy. I've missed you, he choked out. She nodded. I know. Before he could speak again, another presence materialized beside her. A man, his father, who had died of a heart attack when Ethan was 22. And then another. His grandmother. More and more figures began to appear, forming a quiet, expectant circle around him. Some he recognized, some he did not, but all radiated the same peaceful presence. A soft hum filled the air. Ethan felt a shift, as if the very fabric of reality had tilted, and suddenly he was no longer above the crash site. Instead, he was everywhere. Images, sensations, emotions flooded his consciousness all at once. He was reliving his entire life, but it wasn't like remembering. It was as if he was there, moving through each moment as both participant and observer. He felt himself as a child, clutching his mother's hand in a supermarket aisle, watching her smile down at him as he babbled excitedly about a toy car. But this time, he felt her emotions too. The depth of her love, her silent exhaustion, the way she had worried about making rent that month. He was a teenager, standing in his father's garage arguing about college choices. He felt his own frustration, but also his father's, the deep, unspoken fear of losing his son to the world, the helplessness of wanting to guide him but not knowing how. He was a young man, breaking up with his first serious girlfriend. He felt his own determination, the certainty that they weren't meant to be. But now, he also felt her devastation, the heartbreak that lingered for years, the self-doubt he had unknowingly planted in her. Moment after moment, he lived and relived, flipping through his life like the pages of an infinite book. Every decision, every action, every fleeting conversation rippled outward, intertwining with the lives of others in ways he had never imagined. He felt the weight of his choices, the kindnesses that had unknowingly saved people from despair, the careless words that had shattered others. Time didn't exist here. The past, present, and future overlapped, blending into something vast and incomprehensible. He was not just watching his life. He was his life. And then he was more. He could feel the entire fabric of existence, as though he were woven into something infinitely greater than himself. Knowledge flowed into him, not in words or facts, but in understanding. He knew things not just about himself, but about everything. He understood how every life was connected, how no action existed in isolation. He saw other lifetimes, not just his own. He had been here before, and he would be here again. And in that moment, he realized death wasn't the end. It never had been. There was no fear, no sorrow, only acceptance. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The presence of the others faded. The hum of knowledge dulled, retreating into silence. Ethan found himself standing in an endless void, staring into a sky that wasn't a sky at all, but something far greater. And then something moved within it. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was not human, not even close. It stood tall, its form shifting, undefined, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. It had no face, no eyes, but Ethan felt it watching him. Its presence was overwhelming, ancient, endless, filled with an intelligence so vast it made his mind tremble. When it spoke, it was not a voice, but a direct infusion of knowledge into his being. You have seen. You have felt. But now you must choose. Ethan's breath hitched. Choose? He didn't understand. Or maybe he did.
A deep, cosmic realization settled over him. This was the moment he had seen in his dreams. And whatever came next would change everything. Ethan felt himself pulled forward, yanked from the vast expanse of his life review and into something else entirely. The void around him shifted. What had once been a vast nothingness now pulsed with strange colors, shimmering hues that defied description, blues that felt like memories, golds that resonated with music, purples that carried whispers of ancient knowledge. There was no ground, yet he felt himself standing. No air, yet he breathed. Then he was not alone. The presence he had sensed earlier solidified before him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, and yet, on some deep, forgotten level, it felt familiar. The being had no defined form. It shifted, fluid and unbound, as if existing in multiple states at once. At times it appeared vast, towering like a celestial titan. Other times it seemed barely larger than himself. Its body pulsed with flowing energy, an endless spectrum of movement that suggested both physicality and something far beyond it. Ethan felt its gaze, not through eyes, for it had none, but through a presence that pressed into his mind, seeing through every thought, every memory, every hidden fear. And then it spoke. Not in words. Not in sound, but in pure understanding, thoughts pouring into his consciousness as though they had always been there, waiting to be unlocked. You have come far. The voice, if it could be called that, was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft. It simply was. Ethan tried to respond but realized he had no mouth. No body, no voice. And yet, the being heard him anyway. Where am I? The being pulsed. A ripple of silver ran through its ever-shifting form. You are where all things begin and end. Ethan shuddered. He felt no fear, only an awe so profound it ached. Memories of his life review flashed through his mind. The weight of all he had seen, all he had felt. The infinite connections between every action, every thought, every ripple of existence. And then questions. More questions than he had ever thought to ask. What are you? The being shifted again, its form briefly resembling something almost humanoid before dissolving once more. I am. The words carried no arrogance, no mystery, only truth. Ethan's mind spun. He had expected something more, something concrete, something definitive. But deep inside, he already knew. This being was beyond definition, beyond the limits of human comprehension. Why am I here? A pulse of light. Because you were at the threshold. And now you must choose. The words sent a tremor through Ethan's very essence. Choose. He remembered now the dream. The voice that had whispered to him before the crash. This was what it had meant. Ethan hesitated. Choose what? For the first time, the being moved, drifting closer. The space between them shimmered with unseen energy. To stay. Or to return. The weight of those words crashed into him. He thought of the life he had just relived, the love, the regret, the moments of kindness, the wounds he had left on others without even realizing. If he stayed, would it all fade away? He was suddenly aware this place, this existence, was not bound by pain, not tethered to suffering. Here, there was peace, understanding, oneness with all things. Here, he could finally rest. But then, a face flickered in his mind. Rachel. Not as she was in this place, but as she had been in life. Laughing with him as children. Crying the day she lost her job. Hugging him the last time they saw each other. Then his mother. His father. His old friends. And then someone else. A child. Unborn. Unknown. But real. His breath, if he still had breath, hitched. Somewhere in the life he had left behind, there was a future not yet written. A child he had not yet met, a story still unfinished. The realization thundered through him. I can't stay. The being pulsed. You are certain? A wave of understanding washed over him. If I stay, I will never know them. I will never hold them. I will never finish what I was meant to do. A deep silence followed. Ethan felt the weight of eternity pressing upon him. Then at last, the being spoke. Then you must go. But understand, this will not be easy. The vastness of its knowledge unfolded in Ethan's mind, and he saw returning meant pain. It meant feeling the wreckage of his body, suffering through the agony of recovery, facing the disbelief of those who would never understand what he had seen. It meant waking up to a world that had not changed while he had. Could he do it? Did he have the strength to carry the weight of this knowledge? But then he saw her. The child. The one he had not yet met. And he knew. Send me back. The being regarded him for a moment, its form shifting into something golden, something vast and unknowable. Then everything collapsed. The light, the colors, the knowledge, the very fabric of existence, ripped away. A force yanked him downward, through endless space, through memories and moments and time itself. The last thing he heard was the being's voice. echoing within the very core of his soul. Remember, then pain. Blinding, searing, overwhelming. A crushing weight on his chest. A raw, gasping breath tearing through his throat. The wail of sirens. The scent of blood and oil. The harsh flicker of emergency lights. And a voice, distant, shocked, shouting above the chaos. He's alive! Ethan's eyes snapped open. The pull was immediate and violent. One moment, Ethan was surrounded by endless light. The vast knowledge of the universe wrapped around him like a second skin. The next, he was falling. Not in the way a body falls, but in a way that ripped him from eternity, dragging him through the fabric of existence like a thread being yanked from a tapestry. The warmth of the infinite faded. Something heavy pressed against him. A terrible, suffocating weight. Pain. It hit him all at once. A crushing, suffocating force that slammed into his chest, pressing him down, locking him in place. His ribs ached. His lungs screamed for air. His body felt like it had been put through a grinder, each nerve lit with searing fire. Somewhere far away, voices shouted. "He's gone," someone said. "No pulse. He's been down too long." No. A deep, primal instinct took over. The sheer force of wanting to live burned through him. He fought, clawed his way upward through the suffocating darkness. His fingers twitched. A gasp tore from his throat. His chest convulsed, sucking in air like a man breaking the surface of a deep ocean. "Oh my God! He's breathing!" The voices around him shifted. Urgency. Chaos. The clatter of equipment. "Get a pulse reading. His BP is erratic. We need to stabilize him." The world lurched into focus in flickers. Bright red and blue flashing lights. The distorted blur of figures in uniforms moving frantically. Sirens wailed, their high-pitched scream drilling into his skull. A sharp pain exploded in his ribs as hands pressed against his chest. Ethan let out a ragged groan, his vision swimming. "He's responsive." Another voice, closer this time. A woman. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Ethan tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Everything hurt. Something cold pressed against his neck. A pair of fingers searching for his pulse. The blurry shape of a paramedic leaned over him, her face shifting in and out of focus. "You were in an accident," she said. "You stopped breathing. We thought we lost you." "Lost me." Ethan let out a weak, ragged cough. His lips parted. A hoarse whisper scratched its way out. "I came back." The paramedic frowned, tilting her head. "What?" Ethan closed his eyes. The memory of where he had been flickered in his mind. The golden entity, the endless knowledge, the choice. But it was already fading, like a dream dissolving at dawn. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind heavy with everything he had seen, everything he had felt. He had been gone, not just unconscious, gone. He had seen beyond life, touched the infinite, stood before something vast and knowing. And yet, here he was, tethered back to flesh and bone. The doctors called it a miracle. The paramedics admitted they had written him off. Some people nodded in awe at his survival. Others dismissed his story as a hallucination, a trick of the dying brain. Ethan stopped trying to convince them. The words to describe what he had seen didn't exist. Not in any human language. But the feeling remained. A whisper of something greater, a presence he could almost sense in the quiet moments before sleep. He knew now that life wasn't just about moving forward, it was about choosing. Choosing kindness. Choosing love. Choosing to truly be here. Somewhere out there, the being still watched. Still waited. And one day Ethan would return. But not yet. Now he had a life to finish.